the socioculturalist jargon. There are many socioculturalists, but specifically jargon brings out the issue of relationship as central to behavior. So this theoretical framework we are calling social constructionism recognizes that the cultural, the historical, the political, social milieus influence how people, for instance academics, dialogue regarding their experiences of retention. So this work draws on the social constructionist concepts of meaning. These concepts come from the social constructionist perspective, such as meaning, otherness, and social relations as conceptual tools for a social construction of retention. And I'll particularly emphasize the way in which these practices are seen to emerge from socially mediated discourse and normative rules that govern knowledge. And due to time, I'll not share with you all the stories that allude to these concepts that social constructionism brings forward to explain retention, but examples in this work are drawn from extracts using a narrative inquiry approach, where there are narratives of retention as meaning making. And in here, participants or those respondents who told their stories tell us about their stay arising from making meaning out of their academic job and essentially describing their retention experience as that of professional identity. So there are stories of people talking about how identifying with their academic profession is so profound that it explains their retention, and that is the meaning. Then, narratives of retention as social relations, which is another social constructionist concept, are stories of academics expressing engaged scholarship in which they are dealing with varied networks, such as academic peers, consultancies. They are networking, of course, with others, and that explains their retention. Finally, we have narratives of retention as otherness, stories relating to the prestige or the brand image of the institution to which these academics belong, and how outsiders view the status of those academics as members of those institutions. So that prestige, stories of such as prestige, are used to explain their stay. What are the implications for theory and practice? Therefore, I have only two in the interest of time. One is that in studying retention, or in trying to understand how people are retained and why they stay, we need to take in cognizant the importance of context. So rather than the predominantly context-free, individually situated explanations that are provided by the conventional perspectives that I mentioned in behaviorism and humanistic approaches, retention has been, in my work, taken to be an experiential social practice that involves social, relational, and cultural situations as part of the context for explaining retention. Then, we also need to have a new look at an old problem. Retaining people has always been a problem. But the conventional inverse relationship between retention and turnover has now been detangled with this approach, and retention is supposed to be looked at in its own right, and turnover, and they are not two sides of the same coin. Conclusion. Drawing from social constructionism, it is now possible to understand how academics in a public university setting contribute to the reinvention of external manifestations of meaning, which may help to account for their retention. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Nansamba, for the debate on retention, society reconstruct, deconstruct through discourse. And she was trying to help us answer the question, how do you encourage people to stay? consider contextual factors like culture, own's will, appreciate relationship, build institutional image, and others. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to call upon Dr. Barikowa for the next presentation.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. I would like to talk to us about yet an important subject, and that is violence in schools. But this time around, my talk is not looking at schools as universities. I am talking about understanding school-related gender-based violence among primary school children. And just like it has already been mentioned in the chair, my discussion or talk will be based on nuances from the sociocultural perspectives. Violence has been an issue the world over. However, it has been looked at with one universal term, violence, regardless of where it happens. In the morning today, the very first panel after the keynote address, a group of authors were talking about a certain form of violence in Africa, in the world, but specifically in Uganda, where writers try to debate what they referred to as FGM, the female genital mutilation. Now, that is defined as violence in that way. But when it comes to children, and then the violence that has continued to spur in schools, when advocacy comes up, why is it failing to stop it? It's because it has for long been ignored at the earlier levels of education institutions, at the earlier levels of development of children. So my discussion is approaching this from a psychological perspective. Yes, we have had experimental psychologists, we have had social psychologists trying to demystify human development and explaining the evolution of behavior that later explains how people behave and the actions of these people. But when it comes to understanding the specific field, the specific area, just like in relation to today's theme of this conference, looking at the area, looking at the practice, and then how knowledge is evolving, that we are now able to approach this phenomenon from the reality point of view is when we bring the sociocultural studies. We have had many psychologists trying to present human nature. We've had right from the experimental to the early social psychologists, then to their students like Levi Vygotsky, who tries to explain human nature from the social and cultural historical perspective, understanding a being from when that category of being came into existence, their values, how they carry on their values, talk of the means, talk of language, to how they now perform these, and then that will describe them, that will be how they will be known as that category or group of people. Therefore, this is a contribution to a sociocultural vision of human nature and social life in an attempt to explore how children as humans evolve with behavior, which phenomena is conventionalized as violence. So in this talk, I describe a child as an agent and a co-contributor to his or her development. So the sociocultural explanation in this kind of psychology is not leaving out a child so that we now only decry the behavior as there are now strikes, for instance, in schools. Children are ganging against fellow children, or children are being ganged against. And then we only take the phenomenon, excluding the participation of these children. And then some of the advocates are looking at children as mere victims, not as co-creators and co-participants of children, within the environment in which they are developing. Now, the psychology that we bring to the contribution plays a role of trying to make us understand how and where are we living. From the sociocultural perspectives come scholars that bring to us the picture in a very clear way that we are able to understand. And in this case, if we go by the area as a portion of the theme of this conference, we look at Africa. And then these scholars of sociocultural psychology like Bame Nsamenang, who is an African-based psychologist, makes us understand why does behavior happen in the way it does happen. And I can make an analogy from some of us who read religious literature, where they describe God's existence in three: God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, God the Father. And Bame Nsamenang says selfhood or existence can only be understood if we understood humanity in the three selfhoods, and that is social, and that is death, and then ancestry. Social, the way we live determining how we shall behave, how we shall define a given norm, and then either we qualify it as abnormal or normal. And then ancestry, we live because others lived. And this one is a direct contribution to the cultural historical dimension as advanced by Levi Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist. But also death, a very important aspect, because it determines how people behave. People will behave knowing that if I don't do this, I will not maybe have a successful death. And what is successful death in Africa? You see how people fear and how people respect the dead. The dead instantly, and even the dead, those who died long ago. And this one determines how these people live. So when we look at children, and then the behavior, and then the violence, there is no way we can detach them, their behavior, from the environment and the society in which they themselves are actors. And to be able to understand this, the study is done on children between 11 and 15 years. And the children, just giving an example, share interesting testimonies and revelations about their development. Many of them reveal, because they are given voice, they reveal what they perceive as violence and why they are violent. And sometimes what we take not as the violence is what they bring out. And in some of the societies, like where I collect the data, children are sharing what maybe adults are not taking as important, as very important and scaring type of violence in their schools. For instance, they mention issues like kidnap. We have grown up hearing about kidnaps in Africa and many of these societies due to the forests and those swamps and etc. that we have grown up witnessing. But when we are now talking about violence in schools, some of these are ignored. And in the students, the children, the pupils, try to paint a picture that maybe we wouldn't have understood if we didn't consider them as important participants in their development. I conclude this talk by emphasizing that children are, first of all, agents and part of the community in which they grow, and therefore, the best way to understand phenomena surrounding them is when we do understand why they behave the way they behave. And that can never be done if we do not look at the emerging psychologies, and hence the sociocultural turn in psychology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barikowa, for such an informative presentation, Violence in School, the Sociocultural Perspective, and he was trying to explain the reasons why violence continues to spur in schools. He says part of it is human in nature. Are we violent by nature? Possibly you will tell us more about that. Also, he talks about the environment in which the children live and the society. However, as of today, we see children in school fighting their teachers. What brings about that? Maybe Dr. Barikowa can tell us more about the fights between children and the teachers. Thank you very much. May I call upon Dr. Anne Mampaire for the next presentation.
Good evening. My name is Ampire Ann. Taking on a discussion on career choice and students' career transitioning at different levels of education in Uganda. And I'm going to discuss it from the strand of the discursive, constructionist, sociocultural approach. Mainstream career choice debates and engagements have tended to look at a career from a linear progression of roles and trainings across the lifespan. And this has tended to separate the individual from the sociocultural situatedness. This work, however, advocates for an alternative approach to career choice that connects the individual to the social, historical, and cultural context in a relational manner. This work is drawn from my recently concluded PhD work, where I had 83 qualitative students, a sample of students from senior 4, senior 6, and university finalists. And I am trying to share the career, the way they understood career, the way they understood career choice, now in the qualitative, which actually ended up different from the quantitative. A collection, this a sample, although I've said it is 83, because it was a 60 63 secondary school students, and then 20 university students. Now, from the mainstream perspective of career choice debates, whereby we have the traditional theories, because of time which I can't go through, they would be looking at it as a sample, just a mere sample of 83 humans. But from the sociocultural point of view, we look at 83 students presenting, or as a group that presents a collective views, experiences, and understanding of issues of career and career choice, not only from just senior 4, senior 6, and university finalists, but from the past levels where these individuals have gone through, from the current levels where these students are or were at the time of the data collection, and possibly from the future career considerations that transcend the individual self. And because, why am I saying that? From the discursivist, which we are going to look at the characteristics point of view, these individuals' experiences and knowledge or whatever, one individual in a school could be representing number of individuals in a family, again representing the number of individuals from peer group, a number of individuals from the community, a number of individuals from the past levels of education. That is the collection that I'm trying to critique, to use as a critique of the mainstream, which would be looking at 83 as a mere sample size. The attempts by educational institutional framework to separate individual career choice process from the immediate and the wider setting has continued to present serious challenges, not only to students, as I've already said, but to that group which subscribes or which is in the life or in the relation of those individuals. And that is my claim. Why? Because career, those mainstream dimensions or theories have tended to define career from a unidirectional, individualized, urbanized kind of context, myopic context, using predetermined parameters that which limits considerations of actually what is career choice and what is involved in career choice process. And this phenomena of individual with respect to Uganda's transitioning at educational transitional levels has tended to limit the aspirations, the dreams, the thoughts or career thoughts of these youngsters, as we are going to see in this discussion. For example, in this traditional or educational institutional framework, they tend to categorize prefixed career dimensions that you are either this or that. You are either in science or in arts. Going a lower level to HSC, you are either pursuing, as an example, PEM or BCB or PCM, or you are on the other side of arts, where you are doing HLD, HEL, and the likes. And my question now begins by saying, for example, can't we have combinations like biology, chemistry, and history? What's wrong with that? Can't we have combinations like physics, history, economics? Don't you think we would end up with better graduates if we got those kind of dimensions that are actually situated in our context? But for us, because of the formalized, colonized, so-called modernized kind of thinking that has been taken by the mainstream psychology, we think we are made to think and to perceive that such a criteria cannot be there. If you are taking science, then you must be in this or that. So basing on this tinted background, the socio-cultural discursive constructionist, for it places an individual as a product of relational connectedness within and from the social, cultural, and historical setting. So according to them, if you are to look at the issue of a career, there is no way you are going to ignore my father, who is my sponsor. There is no way you are going to ignore my siblings. There is no way you are going to ignore the fact that maybe I'm the firstborn in a family. Because from the social cultural context, being a firstborn, it has a lot. You must be an example. You must be a caretaker. You must be ready at one point in time to take on the young ones. So that is the approach that I'm using to critique the mainstream, and simply because every community or setting has its own way of doing things, has its own norms, has its own culture, has its own history. In the African context, giving an example from the community where I'm familiar with, we have people like Abahiji, we have people like Abajubi, we have people like Abahesi. Commonly, you know, they are identified by their traditional way of life. That these ones are fishermen, these ones are hunters, these ones are blacksmiths, etc. And it tends to pass on. And that is the socio-cultural relational view or standpoint of view that is being advanced by this. It should determine students transitioning from school to community. We are having issues to mention, but not limited to, this graduate unemployment, whereby, why did I, in the background I said urban mentality, you know, unidirectional. Most of the graduates that will graduate, they want to stay in urban, cosmopolitan centers. And yet you find that if you are to go rural, the jobs are there. That you cannot blame them, because that is the way our thinking has been. Now, look at the family from this discursivist point of view. We would be considering issue like, because in our context, family name. The parents at home, they will be telling their children who are making career choices that you must sustain our legacy. In our family, we don't have failures. In our family, we are teachers. So you must fit into that. So we must take into consideration all that. Family history. I was good at this, or your dad was this and that. Although that one in itself, in the Africanness, has its own challenges because of the hegemonic orientation. When children are wise, or they are brilliant, or they are geniuses, that is the father's gene. When the children are contrary, that is the mother's. But however, depending on the way we look at it, as a family investment, some of these careers I've already said, they are taken up basing on the past achievements or failures. But you tend to find that that one also has its own connotation, culture, at a family, school, and community level. Each level of this family, school, community has its own dynamics. At a family, I've already tackled that. At school, some students are boxed into what the framework of the school. You must fit into this because those are the teachers that are available. You must fit into this because that's what is marketing our school. Community. Some people will say, what will the public think when they know that I'm at a university pursuing a course in? There are some schools where, for example, agriculture cannot be allowed to be taken by students because of their reasons. They say, how can this school It is one of the first world schools. How can it be taking agriculture? Then some parents will be saying, how will they say that my son, my daughter is pursuing a course in? So all that came out from those people's utterances. Then finally, a component of sex, that is to the mainstream, and gender to the sociocultural. It has, all these are steeped into the sociocultural and historical setting. However, we must not be swayed to the fact that all is gold, because some of these values, assumptions, norms, etc., in the sociocultural setting, they turn out, in the end, sometimes turn out to be stereotypes, negative stereotypes, influencing negatively. Now, there are a number of implications where we can, in our theorization of career choice, in practice, we need to avoid as much as possible that issue of legitimizing certain careers are good, certain careers are bad. The assertion that humans are capable of making independent career choices to improve their own lives and those of others also is questionable in its viability, because we have already seen that there is no individual, according to the discursivist constructionist theory or approach. There is no individual. This individual you are seeing here is a representation of a tree of so many individuals in terms of reality. Number three, caretakers, including parents, teachers, guardians, should be flexible to accommodate these new trends. For example, if we are to borrow a leaf from the COVID pandemic, so many things change. Professionals who are doing non-professional work, etc. Can't we learn something from there? Another implication, there is need for a roundtable discussion, especially with adolescents, young people, and all of us, if we are to forge a way forward in terms of career choice and undo the challenges. Career choice is not a one-time event or activity. These engagements, conversations should be, taken to different levels in order to interest the young ones. Second, young people should be allowed to explore wide options and possibilities, to transcend these so-called box careers. You are either a lawyer or if you are not a lawyer, then you are a doctor, or this or that. There is no middle line. Finally, what should the question that we go with in terms of conclusion, what should teachers, administrators, parents, students, and all stakeholders, what should we do in order to get out of that syndrome of the career choice challenges that are arising out of the institutionalization of career choice as a social phenomenon? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ampire, for such an informative conversation about career transitioning across lifespan. We have heard of the colonialist models of arts versus science subjects, and why not blending arts with the science. There are also sociocultural-based occupations from our cultures, family historical occupations. What then would be the best way of making a career choice? And the recommendation is, if I had quoted you right, round table discussions with adolescents, explore opportunities, allow them to explore our opportunities. And how can you do this? Do you mean you can start all over? You start in one line, one career, and then start all over again and all over again? Maybe we need to clarify more about the exploration of opportunities out there. Thank you, Dr. Anne. Thank you very much. Now I call upon Dr. Francis Eboyo.
printed copy. Yeah, I'd sent you, but because of time, I can manage it. It's fine. Good evening, colleagues, Madam Chair. Francis Eboyo, my name, as it has been said. I will start off from where my colleague, Dr. Anne Ampire, asked the question or proposed that there should be participation among the parents, teachers, students, and other people who are linked to students' education. The colonial system, as the chair has just rightly noted, probably particularized things. But in this, we realize that even in academics itself, most of the debates have been especially through what we call the sciences. And science here, I'm not limiting it to only physical sciences, but generally the study of sciences, including political science, social science, and so forth, has been limited in two extremes. First, in the unexperienced positivism on one hand, and then on the other hand, on the laissez-faire constructivism and relativism. Now, these two extremes look broad. On one hand, there is no participation, and that is what has been experienced by the students that Dr. Ampire quotes. And then on the other hand, on the extreme, there is the relativism where we allow subjectivity, where we allow agency. My presentation will focus on the sociocultural aspect, which emphasizes on the social, cultural, and historical perspectives. But particularly, I'll use the cultural historical activity theory or CHAT perspective, which bases on social relations about the nature of human development and agency. From CHAT, I will call cultural historical activity theory CHAT for the purpose of this presentation. So CHAT offers a logical and collective materialist vision of human nature. In other words, things are done in a way that the participants are involved, not ignoring their history. They are collective and they all participate, but with an aim of transforming their society or their world. In these practices, they have social interactions, which was denied actually in the old traditional approach of colonialism. And these practices lead into interactions or call for interaction of the participants, that is the students, the teachers, and the educational administrators, which are reciprocal and eventually they merge into new practices. So we see an emergence of new practices when people get involved. And if this is done, then we realize that this approach enables us to address the issue of injustice. CHAT enables us to address the issue of injustice, which is common in the world today. Particularly, I will look at injustice in education. Injustice in education, just to quote an example, is seen in the transmission of knowledge with the thinking that it is the teacher who knows everything, while the student or the students are assumed to be empty vessels that do not know anything. That is why you see, even in the arrangement of this classroom or in this auditorium, the students are supposed to be there, the teacher is supposed to be this side, higher, so it is assumed the one who is here has all the knowledge, you who is the other side is empty, ready to receive. I don't know if it is true. So, if we take CHAT as a perspective, we realize that it diverts from the norm of thinking that things should be just poured into other people, and those who pour those things into other people are the knowledgeable ones, while the others are empty. But CHAT, through its principles, the first principle is that it is relational and dynamic in all its approaches. And also, it looks at the historical perspective. This is a deviation from the norm, which has been that we transmit material from one side to the other. The second principle of chart is that it looks at the mind. The mind is conceptualized as being sociocultural and historical. It is produced from the sociocultural interactions, and historical bases are also linked. But these are through activities, and the activities connect people. So it connects the teacher and the learner. When they are involved in an activity, both of them get the knowledge from there. Now, we realize that if this is taken, it therefore helps us to fill the gap, the Cartesian gap, that thinks that there is a knower on one side, and then there is knowledge on the other side, which is supposed to be picked. Yet this knowledge can be generated together through activity. The third principle is that thinking is about changing nature. When we look at the mind as an activity, we think through the mind which is out there, unlike the mind which we have been taught from colonial time that it is embedded somewhere in the head of the human being. But even scientists themselves have failed to show where the mind is in the head. Sometimes they tell you it is the brain, sometimes they tell you something else, but nobody has been able to tell us where the mind is. And chart is telling you the mind actually is not in the brain. The mind is out there in the activities that we engage in. The last principle is that chart emphasizes transformation through collaboration using goal-directed activity. Form skills to change. Then you use those skills in those activities and be able to perform. So what did I do having looked at this? I did end up carrying out a study, which is part of my PhD work, and I did a study among undergraduate university students and employed individuals. I just picked part of the data, the qualitative data, where I interviewed 4 undergraduate students and 4 employed individuals and got their short life stories. The findings were interesting. First, using active learning, students were seen to be able to develop a number of skills. I'll start with the first skill, the soft skills. They were able to develop skills like teamwork skills, relationship skills, communication skills, and self-confidence. Students were able to stand in front of their classrooms. Some classes are as big as 200 students, yet these students are from HSC who could not even talk. I would have testimonies of students who you tell to talk and they come towards besides you as a lecturer and say, "Sir, but for me my voice is low, I cannot even talk. What will I do?" Then of course you encourage them and eventually they talk. And after they talk, some are now in employment and they testify and say, "You helped me. Now I can talk and I can address a number of people, including big gatherings." Students, therefore, were able to develop those skills. The other finding came from the employed. Because of time, the other finding came from the employed. The employed, I found out that people's relationships and their interests facilitate transfer of skills. I use particularly one case here of the person I interviewed. This is a graduate of urban planning. This graduate of urban planning came to Makerere University to a friend. A friend was working in food science. This friend had visited his home because he was a friend to his brother, carried some concentrate which he had made. Now, this particular student, who is a graduate of urban planning, became so interested and started moving with this gentleman, the lecturer of food science. Eventually, even up to today, he is now producing juices. He has actually advanced into producing animal medicine, plant medicine, harbor-based, and that is where he's earning a living. He's fully employed and employing more than 50 people countrywide. So we then see that there is potential when we use participation, when we use activities of people, instead of pouring the so-called knowledge into them. Because the sociocultural, historical aspect of it helps these people to immediately participate, act, and transfer knowledge to their communities. Now, having said that, the collective aspect in which individuals are allowed to participate together with their educators or instructors and even members of their communities helps them to practice and interact into conversations with others. And this is actually related to the CHAT principles. CHAT provides that people's continuous transformative activities produce useful knowledge over time. This is what we can see in the urban planning graduate. He did not practice urban planning, but went into juice production initially. Today, he has been transformed into doing what he actually quotes, and I quote, he calls it holistic science. And his philosophy about this is that if you only treated a human being or you fed a human being, where will the plants come from? So he had also to make medication for plants. Then he went to animals. He also makes for animals. And he actually makes medication for human beings. And this one now I have a testimony to give. And this is to me as a participatory researcher. Those who know me and remember me, I used to put on specs. But when I say it, people now realize, hey, so you put on specs. And they say, where are the specs? I no longer put on specs. Through that guy, that he told me that we can work on this. I didn't believe it initially, but he did it. So he makes medicine for animals, human beings, and plants. So why are we saying we don't have? We can transform, allow people to engage in these activities. I know the colonial system will ask, is he qualified? Where is his certificate? You know those questions, and I'm not bringing it here. But I'm saying we have enough within us that we can utilize. So the testimony is here, ladies and gentlemen. What are the implications? In conclusion, what are the implications for this? The implications for this, therefore, is that, one, we need collaborative teams consisting of academicians and practitioners to identify soft skills and other skills that are needed for employment. We have cried for employment. Why don't we have employment? But we have seen that particular case and other cases. Secondly, students should be provided the opportunity to examine theory and practice so that they discover the methods under which they can learn course material. Let's not push as academicians that this is how you should learn. No, allow students to learn. They will tell us even how they can learn better. The third implication is that educational administrators and active learning instructors should design learning environments that enable students to perform activities to enhance better learning. And lastly, we need to flatten organizational structures and update our curriculum. When I talk about flattening organizational structure, I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about even time. This thing of saying the lecture is from 8 to 9. You meet students 3 times a week, 3 hours a week. In active learning, it doesn't work. Students should be able to meet you anytime when they have a question. So you will have shortened the organizational structure. Thank you very much for now.
Thank you very much, Francis. conventional learning approaches poses injustice to students. And this is because teachers have all the knowledge, that is the assumption, and the students are just empty vessels which are waiting to be filled. Yeah. And the recommendation, why don't we use experiential learning approaches instead? Because they help students to interact with their environment directly. Now, here I'm challenged because I know as far as our students are concerned, they will prefer the pamphlets. And the first time you enter the class, they're asking for the pamphlets. At what level are we going to intervene? Because this is a practice right from primary school. Maybe we need more to know about the intervention. Thank you very much. And now let's have our discussant, Professor Julius Chikoma, on board. Thank you.
The chairperson of this session, thank you very much, and good afternoon, Dr. Nansufuga. Good afternoon, everybody who has stayed the course up to this point. I know afternoon sessions can actually be very difficult, especially if you have enjoyed, the well-prepared lunch that we all had. And I hope I should not add to the difficulties of contending with a long session, which might also be boring if we don't try and just stick to the key messages. Now, let me start with a bit of background to this panel, and to put the discussion of this panel in context. I am the common factor in this panel because I have actually supervised most of the people here, I think apart from one. So they are my PhD supervisees. And two, what they have been sharing with us comes off work that we started at the discussions in the school when we created a forum for PhD students in the School of Psychology some 3-4 years ago. That PhD forum was instituted after realizing that, the open-ended nature of a PhD student life in Makerere was so isolating that we needed to create some environment where there can be some experience sharing. So we created what we called then, and which continues to be called a PhD platform. And then we agreed that it shouldn't be just sharing on, the things that are making us suffer, but also let's really engage in some kind of intellectual debates around things that we are studying. So the issues that they are discussing here as a result of some agreement that we came up with after a lot of interesting debates around the question of knowledge in the discipline of psychology and the dominance of a particular paradigm in how everyone else was studying and trying to address psychological questions. Now, the second aspect of my context that I want to give is that actually the title that we chose for this panel goes like this: Sociocultural Psychologies, Interrogating the Theoretical Promise of Selected Brands in a Meta-Colonized Context. Now, I would like to give a bit of a background on this concept of meta-colonized, given that in the conversations that we've had with earlier presenters today, and also what we had yesterday, the question of a colonial context keeps coming up. And in psychology, we find that the key subject of study in psychology is actually the individual. But the way that individual is studied in psychology, we found that there is a lot that depends so much on a Western conception of an individual, which also we should understand that it's something that is steeped in, the Western liberal understanding of a modern subject. Since psychology studies an individual, it means that our biggest selling point as a discipline should be knowledge that helps people understand about themselves. So we decide that let this panel engage with this question of who is an individual, but from a theoretical perspective. That's how we come to actually zero on the concept of selfhood. Who is this individual that psychology studies? And what do we know from the mainstream or the predominant modes of knowing that we have actually been exposed to? And the panel has just shown that actually the mainstream modes of knowledge that most mainstream psychologists have provided have so many limitations. Most of those limitations relate to the concept of the idea that this individual is studied but without context. And yet it is so important if anyone is to understand an individual or even understand themselves. It's very important to understand the context within which they be. So we decided that we need to read more, we need to find out more about conceiving a psychological subject from a sociocultural perspective. And of course, we still found a lot of literature that is framed in the Western mold, but we were inspired by writings on sociocultural psychology that comes from Africans themselves. And I will quote you two scholars for the purpose of just trying to be able to put in context what these individuals here have shared with us. One point of inspiration in this direction of comprehending the context, the sociocultural context of being that we actually used. We used the thoughts of one South African psychologist in the book that he wrote, which was titled Being Black in the World. All of us know that, in South Africa, they definitely come from a more recent experience of shrugging off, colonialism. They are the latest of, the nation states on this continent to really come out of that through struggles. But Chabandi Manganyi, in this book, gives us two schemas of understanding how to be black in the world. Of course, he was talking about black South African, but when you read the book, you also find that that conception actually can extend to anyone black in this world. And it gives two issues. That there is the first schema, which is called the individual schema. As a human being who is born as an individual, there is the way you understand yourself as a human being. Like I will understand myself that, I have some principles, I have some values, I have integrity. I have all those things that actually I think a human being should have, that should be emulated. That is called the individual schema. a schema that you can use to understand yourself. But he also adds and says that in the world, as we live in the world, especially as he was describing living in the world as a black person, or living in the South African world as a black person, there is the second schema that takes into account the society. And he called it the sociological schema. He said that the sociological schema is what now society uses to define who you are. Society will have a conception of you that in many cases does not exactly map with your own conception of yourself. So the sociological schema will then say for a black person, that's what the book says, that for a black person, everything you know about yourself will actually be taken to not be what they expect of you. And he gives two examples. The concept of keeping time, for instance. You know, we have so many people here who can inspire us in terms of keeping time, right? And you will know that, you are, one of those people who really is stickler to time, you keep time. But when you use the sociological schema, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, there is this idea of African time. Where does it come from? It comes from the sociological schema. We don't keep time. As Africans, we don't keep time. We don't have integrity. We don't have everything else. So you'll find, like me, I'll think of myself as having all these very good values. But when I put those in the sociological schema, they are taken away from me. So we thought that in trying to have a theoretical framework that will help us understand the context in which this psychological subject that we're studying, we needed perspectives like those of Chabani Mangani in understanding, the individual, in understanding the individual self and how it develops, and what we see when we study the specific issues about this individual. We also got inspiration from another Cameroonian, and I think one of the presenters has mentioned, so I will not spend so much time on it, but we're also inspired by Bame Nsaminanga, is actually a Cameroonian, in his theoretical description of, the cycles of human development, meaning that, the way we go through life, we go through cycles. And so when things happen to us, there is a way we can explain them and live with those realities without really degenerating into, negative behaviors. And so he goes on to give very good frameworks in which to understand how to relate with children as they develop relationships with adults, and all adults, develop relationships with everybody else. So these are some of the foundational ideas that we thought should inspire the way to understand, the very crucial subject of psychology, the individual. So, chairperson of the session, I thought I needed to give that context before I can just, make some few remarks about, what we have heard from these presenters here. And I will just say that in the way these presentations have gone, all of them have something that holds them together, even though they are addressing different topics. Of course, we have, someone discussing the question of retention, someone discussing the question of gender-based violence, someone discussing the question of learning and school environments and workplaces, as well as career choice. The sociocultural psychology framework is one theoretical lens that binds them together, even though they use different conceptions in understanding individuals in addressing those questions. But what comes from using that sociocultural framework is that it allows them to think differently and to think afresh in how much they can go with, already made theoretical templates that had been dominating the areas they are studying. The theoretical templates, be they those of behaviorism, those of cognitive psychology, those of, all these other frameworks that they, many times would be the easy tools to pick, theoretical tools. So the sociocultural frameworks that they have used work with those assumptions that, individuals are relational and in interaction and in all these other aspects of, making choices, making decisions, and that context is very important. And the context that the sociocultural framework really talks about is that beyond the interpersonal interactions that social psychology provides psychology to understand relationships, it is important to interrogate the broader societal cultural context, political context, and so on, including history. And when you do that, you are then able to actually start asking fresh questions. And I'm happy to see that when, for instance, when Dr. Nansamba speaks about this question of retention, her discussion of the topic takes us away from the managerialist interest in questions of people who live. And I'm sure here at Makerere we might relate with it. We have this conversation going on around, a very big number of staff who have left or who have actually resigned. So it would initially be something that we then need to spend more time in the question of why are people leaving? And there is a lot of knowledge developed on that and so on, and advice and recommendations from a lot of managerialist theories that have been applied. But here, in this particular perspective, the sociocultural framework allows to interrogate the history, the politics, and all these other things, so that you can be able to take interest that despite, for instance, this whole conversation and call for a re-examination as a result of, pro rata questions among academic staff. Academic staff still want to stay in Makerere. We have more people wanting to stay. So why isn't there then more scholarship that is geared towards addressing the question of stay? Why do people stay? Because the interest is, how can you make the environment better so that people stay there? That is the beauty of changing the lens in how to ask very ordinary questions or contemporary questions in the area of debate. The same can be said about the discussions that Balikowa gave us around this question of children's agency and the question of school-based violence. Again, it allows for asking new questions around why is it that we see children, even when we are sure that they have not sufficiently gathered understanding of their own identity, they are very violent. Where does this come from? His discussion, of course, helps us to start taking the question of children's agency very seriously. And I think that some of the issues that his work brings out are very good for helping schools change the framework and mode of actually handling students when it comes to how to intervene in questions of children's interactions in school. So I think I can go on and on and on, but I can only say that all these frameworks are bringing interesting and fresh insights in rethinking the way we think about the problems of research in our traditional disciplines, and being challenged to ask questions differently and change how we view, ordinary questions, like the question of career. When you look at the issue of career and how the discursive or the social constructionist approach that Ampire Ann is grappling with, it comes from a place where it looks like when we think career, we think institutions. When we think career, we think a certain defined path. But when you allow yourself to interrogate that same question using these perspectives that are steeped in sociocultural understandings, then you can also take seriously the question of self-employment as part of how we can now think anew about this question of career. So, Chairperson, I think those are the few issues that I can bring out of the papers that were discussed this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, our discussant, Professor Julius Chikoma, for those notes and elaboration on the various topics that have been presented. I would now turn to the audience and ask for people who would like to ask questions, and we are going to register only 5 questions, if any. Can we have the microphone, please? There is a hand up there and another hand here, and the third one, the fourth one.
Well,
the first one is behind there. Please mention the topic of interest, where the question goes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My question goes to the Madam in red. I don't remember her name very well.
Career choice.
Yes, she talked about students having problems in schools. I just want to get from an academic perspective, what could explain the very rampant strikes and chaos in schools in northern Uganda? If you followed during this year, very many schools in West Nile and coming to areas of Acholi and Lango sub-region faced a lot of strikes from students. What do you think is causing this, and perhaps how can this very big challenge, because it's frustrating the education sector, how can it be addressed from your view as a psychologist? Thank you so much, Madam.
all right. Good afternoon, the chair and everyone. I am Igbeni Dorothy Aumbo. My question goes to the person who presented on violence in schools. You talked about understanding violence, and of course you traced it to the homes, their culture, and many of that. But I didn't understand you when you, in fact, I didn't get you or didn't pinpoint where you were able to tell us how this based violence or school-based violence could be reduced. So could you please let us know? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is John Kahuya. My question goes to Dr. Richard about the gender-based violence. That is where I'm going to intervene. I've seen in a situation in some schools, of course, I understand this study from Uganda perspective, but I'm taking the Western African countries perspective, that there is a sexual mutilation which is considered as a culture practice, regulated, legitimized, and recognized officially by everyone all over. I don't know how do you counter that aspect, because this is from school, and I understood also from presentation, they were talking of agents, participation of these children, not only to undergo what is going on, but they have also to be part of what have to be for their own interest and the interest of the communities. My second question goes to Dr. Nasamba. For Dr. Nasamba, it was about the importance of course, I see the theory and practice, importance of context, and we need to have a new look to old problems. Now, in terms of context, of course, all over the world, they keep on talking of local dynamic, local context, even in different settings. Then here my question is how this can be addressed, and yet somewhere it was said about the self, that individuals. And of course, we have Africa like an isolated continent, on an isolated country when you look at sociological perspective, the way we perceive ourselves. Wherever you are in the world, you will find yourself like African and you behave like African. There are different parts of the world. Of course, it's not in African continent, but you'll find dirty everywhere, and then they say, this is how Africa we are. This is how we live. There are different places which have been nicknamed African names, African countries, African street when you are outside African continent. Then, now this issue of context, how this can be addressed in such circumstances where we as African, we have that kind of ideas of wherever you are in the world, like you are in nowhere, you are looking for matoke there. And you behave, you say, no, I don't want to behave like these people because me, I'm a Ugandan. I don't want to behave myself like this because I need to keep my context, my local dynamic, and I keep on behaving as a pure local Ugandan wherever I am all over the world. Although it is not accepted, it is not taken to the other culture or whatever. And how do we integrate also this when it comes to the family, school, and community? Because Dr. Ann was talking of how this can be built up. And of course, the way we reflect, it comes from family background, school, communities. I understand here in Makerere, for instance, we have a culture which is different from other universities where I have the chance to be. Because here we talk of the culture of Makerere is excellence, rigor, clarity, and all this. But also in some other families, they have this legacy of violence, which has been there, which has been taught from the childhood and the youth and the adolescent, that you need to fight back whatever comes. As a community, we are fighters. How do we extend or expand to that? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Twekambe Kabarul is my name, a fresh graduate, having pursued a bachelor's degree in arts with education, that is literature in English and English language, though passionate about digital marketing and blogging and influencing. So, I was so thrilled with the professor, I think doctor, who said the power of association can create new professions. Indeed, I liked his presentation, and it was coming to my side. The fact is, everything, most of the times nowadays, it is brought about by passion and association, even when you do not have qualifications. But I am asking, doctor, because most of our parents, the environment we have grown from, they still have a perspective that what you have studied is what you should do. As a doctor, one who is known to be at Makerere University, what advice would you give so that the parents and the environment can change this perspective? Because we've seen, me, I got a phone when I had finished senior 6, but right now there are those people who think that I am a computer wizard, I am a journalist, yet literally I am a teacher in making. And there is a certain BAM International, just someone has a certificate, I think a diploma, but right now she makes medicine for COVID-19. She has made hundreds of millions from COVID-19 and people have been cured. She makes medicine for cancer. Ministers, MPs, you find them there. And she has 2 to 3 branches. So how best, as a professor, would actually, which concept would you give to the education sector so that they can change that perspective in the whole of Uganda, in that people should be driven by passion and association, in that when there is someone that you feel is your role model, you should pay close attention to them as you become part of them. If you have passion in something, then you become one of that you feel like, rather than people putting us to the professions that we have studied. Otherwise, they look at us as failures, yet we are not failures. There is where we can do best. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. I'm going to invite the panelists who come and respond to the questions, starting from Dr. Anne, and I think we'll move like this to this end.
Thank you, members, for these interesting questions. I think the first question was addressing the northern uprisings in schools in terms of strikes. And my answer to that, it goes back to what I've already said, our institutionalized mindsets. Thinking that, you know, once you are on the bench, you have it all, you can say it all in terms of administrative style of management. The student has no say, it's just a subject, and therefore should be submissive. And it comes back to one of the recommendations that I said, in which is rooted in these sociocultural approaches, to say that in this reality or construction of knowledge, we are co-partners. And these students, mark you, in the learning institution, they are key stakeholders like any administrators or what. And surprisingly, some of those administrators in school X or institution X may not be having even a child in that school, but they are good at implementing the do's, the don'ts. So that's what I can say, that we need to go back to the drawing board, knowing that there is nothing like I know it all because of age, because of experience, or because of which angle I'm seated. No, we need to listen to them. They are our clients. We need to hear what they say and then come to a compromise. Whereby, yes, I agree that in some way, as in any institution, there must be some norms, some standards of conduct. But once you have taken them through to understand where are these ones coming from, it will make your life a little easier. Then a colleague talked about how do we deal with culture? Huh? How do we deal? You were asking Dr. Francis, but you spilled over to me and you said there was something with me. In terms of culture, how do we deal with? Can I? It was for you. Okay, because I had him mention my name. And the last question, let me leave it to Francis. I thought it was coming to me.
Yeah, but it was coming. Actually, I think it is a career transition question.
But it was coming. Okay.
Oh, okay, thank you very much once again. Probably, let me start with the question that arose from the chair of this panel. She was saying, relying from what I said about active learning, where it says you go to class and the first thing the students ask, where are the handouts? You're the lecturer. First lecture, you're moving out, they tap you. They actually tap you, they have the courage. All of you will you know this. Even him, he knows, a recent graduate. Where are the notes? Now, that happened to me as well, but I overcame it. How do you overcome it? One, we need training for facilitators, for the lecturers. And the lecturers have to change their role from the old perspective of being the lecturer, the knowledge owner who has everything. We need to be aware that the students also, where they're coming from, they have knowledge, they have experiences. They can reflect on them. So one of the things first the lecturer will face is that you are going to lose that authority, that power, the thinking that you have all the knowledge. With availability of information technology, internet, students actually have a lot more information. A few of you will remember the concept of yellow notes. Notes you have used 10 years ago and you're still using, others even use it for 20 years. So what the students do is they ask the previous group, please give me your notes, They're asking you where are the notes because they already have the notes and they want to compare. You are in a challenge. They want to compare. Is it the same that you gave last year that you are going to give us this year? And when they get that, you'll realize your class will be like this. If it was full, it is supposed to be full. This is the number you'll get. Why? They already have the notes. So what do they want? And the notes are from you. That's why they're asking you where are the notes to confirm. You are the authority. So please be ready to relinquish the authority, the power. And then take them through that they can get the knowledge from various sources. I've mentioned the internet. I've mentioned books, workplaces. Some organizations have resource centers and so on. Then they can pick from that. But remember, these are students from S6 who have been trained based on the other approach. The teacher has all the knowledge. The student doesn't know anything. He or she is an empty vessel. So you compare the two, traditional teaching approach, the cooperative or collaborative learning approach, and this is one of the first session things I take them through. We don't go to the subject matter. The first thing we first go through is to compare the two and see where the advantage is and how it can be done. So once you do that, it can go through. But of course, I can't answer it all here. I say you need training for the facilitators. And your role as a teacher is going to change. It is going to become bigger. You're going to be a moderator. You're going to be a facilitator, an instructor, a manager, and all that. Two, the question that comes from the recent graduate, that parents think that what you studied is what you must do. Now, what inspired me in my PhD study was actually that issue. I watched videos from the US where, some of you will check on YouTube, where actually people were burning their certificates because they were not getting jobs. Yet they have paid, and their situation is worse than ours because they give students loans and students have to pay. Then the certificate you have got does not get you a job. So we need now to educate our parents. And good enough, you are going to be a parent if you are not yet already one. So you need to relax these other children now and allow that they have this knowledge and they should be able to work. The active learning approach is such a way that the student will not work alone. They will work in small groups of 7 to 10 people with the help of the facilitator. The lecturer changes their role from a lecturer to a facilitator. You work with these students. That's why I was saying, anytime these students should have access to you, reduce on the organizational structure length, let it be shorter in terms of time of students meeting you. So that's how I can respond briefly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair, I will respond to mine from here. And 2 questions were raised, and I realized they are speaking to the same. Dorothy, thank you. She asks, how can it be reduced? That is the school-related gender-based violence. And then the brother asks that this topic of discussion speaks not only to Ugandan society, but also the rest of Africa and probably the world. And is asking, for instance, in West Africa, there is a practice of female genital mutilation. And this practice, in its sense, is violence and it's gender-based. But then, if it is normalized and is taken as a culture, from us as scholars of psychology on violence, how can that be looked at? Now, these 2 questions, I merged them into one. One, when I was talking my topic, I brought to our concern that children should be looked at not from the isolation point of view as non-participants in society, but bringing it to a practical point of view. All the practices and values we cherish now, have we ever wanted to ask how they came into existence? For instance, right now, if you walk while wearing a mask, no one will get disturbed at all. But those days, before the advent of this pandemic that we are yet to conclude, you would look weird wearing a face mask. Actually, people will wonder why you are putting it on. One time I led a group of students to go and do charity work in Katanga here. And then our university students were putting on masks. The people in Katanga told me as a leader of this group to send away the students because we are not considering them as humans, because for them they live in that place and they are okay. Why are we putting on gloves and masks before we clean Katanga? But right now, if you dress up in a mask and you walk or you sit or you go to any place, no one will be astonished. Now, what if the putting on of masks becomes part of our living socially, and then we continue. If we don't socioculturally rewind, how did this one start? And then we only instruct our children, you either wear a mask or you don't come to the public. Where will they get the knowledge? Where will they get to know, as members of society, how the masks came into use in our societies? For instance, female genital mutilation. What is the history, socioculturally, behind female genital mutilations? There has to be a history behind this practice, which practice was normalized, even if such a context is no longer existing as used to be. Scholars, sociological and anthropological scholars may know the advent of some of these practices. When did they start circumcising women? Actually, not circumcising, cutting their genitals. How and where did they start? What was the reason? Now, if we do not interrogate the histories socioculturally behind some of these societal sciences, because this should have come as a preventive measure, just like maybe we are wearing masks to prevent, just like scholars who tell us about how a fork came into use, the cutleries. And then later, we transformed them into style. You even hear other people saying in this sabuti, I eat using sticks. And that becomes a norm. And some people even start admiring. And those who cannot use sticks to pierce into a piece of meat or food to eat feel anxious and feel they do not possess the stylish etiquette. Now, in sociocultural studies, we say, can we be kind enough to recognize this human being that is just coming into society, to let them know why? The whys of the psychologies behind the norms, other than just normalizing a situation. As I end the response to this question, I refer you to the Southern Africa, especially South Africa. When you check the indices, South Africa ranks, if not number one, it should be among the very first countries where violence and crime is at the rise. Actually, it ranks number one in terms of violence. There, one has no shame to rob you on cameras. Regardless, someone can just walk here and start robbing you. I am speaking this not from a claim, but this is what is happening in South Africa. Right now, we hear about xenophobia, complaining about people who are even from just across the border. Now, where does this come from? We know the histories behind the psychology of apartheid in South Africa, where the natives had only to leave if they fought for their rights. Now, that has been normalized and it has turned into a culture that even if they rob you, that is not a point of concern. And so that is how society has emerged. And so if you read the bigger of my work, I say, until we demystify these sociocultural contexts, we risk transgenerational instances of violence that can turn into culture. You've heard of tribes that say, for us, we are tough. For us, we don't joke. But because these are only signs of the traumatic situations they went through because of calamities. So this is the approach that we are bringing, and we say we should not ignore these children. Now, some people may misinterpret and say we are saying children should be left to act because they are adults. No. And those who came from Mesa here, as I end, warned. Actually, they were referring to Mam Dan's writings. When Mam Dan asks, should we ignore colonialism plus all its inclusions? Should it be a holistic rejection? Or should we interrogate and say what applies and what should not? So that we do not land into stagnation of life. I don't know whether my response has been useful to you, but this is what we are talking about. We are looking at reality and situation and demystifying what has been happening to us, and then not leaving children in isolation and we say, let them just determine, or let us tell them, don't, do, don't. And then we end up into, or with a generation that we cannot manage even to live with. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your question. I'm going to answer you in only 2 ways, considering the issue of time. So in regard to retention, you were asking me how we can address the concern. And I would like to refer you to the first quote I made that referred to alternative theorizing in this area of retention. I was trying to allude to the fact that, yeah, when you go back and check the retention terrain, that kind of literature, the kind of studies that have been around retention, you will realize that much of it is steeped in those what we call mainstream or conventional perspectives that look at retention in a certain way, and in their looking at retention in that way, they avoid what I'm calling the social and cultural context. I was very specific on the type of context I was referring to, and in eschewing that context, they tend to fail to explain why, for instance, I'll give you an example of Makerere or public universities in Uganda. What would explain a situation where there are incessant strikes by employees, they complain of unappealing working conditions, but they stay? Yet, mainstream retention literature postulates that if such conditions, like I said with behaviorists, if they are not reinforcing them, or if their personal agency, according to humanists, doesn't allow them to feel that these conditions are worth it, then they will leave. And that drives them in that discussion that the opposite of retention is turnover. And we have seen that in this kind of theorizing where we interrogate retention in its own right and discover that you can have knowledge in retention that is situated and perspectival, then we can explain the circumstances that are happening in these public universities, and we give answers to why academics stay despite sometimes unappealing working conditions. And you realize that is a novel contribution to the retention terrain or area, because before that, that kind of thinking around retention was not to be. Secondly, the question you asked about the context globally, it goes back. In our sociocultural theorizing, we do not universalize anything. Context, even in socioculture, is situated. It is not a universalized kind of context. So when you look at context, referring, if I left Uganda and went to whatever, those other parts, still it will be situated and perspectival. And the experiences I'll get from there and share that experiential knowing will be determined by that specific context. And that is the kind of theorizing we are trying to bring forth to this debate that we are calling social constructionism. Thank you so much.
Okay, a minute. I wanted to ask if the last question was answered. Was your question answered? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really know that no question was my way because I wasn't presenting formally. I was just talking over the topics. But I was intrigued by his input, where he says that this question of context, we seem to be taking it too far. Did I understand it like that? And then he gives the issue of everywhere you go outside of the continent, you'll find, Africans trying to assert themselves and saying we're Africans and creating villages in places in Europe and everywhere. And then I was saying, okay, what is the problem? They came here and they extended empires in Africa. What is wrong with us just trying to create villages there? I mean, so I really didn't understand that question. But the point I'm making here is that I think the value of putting context is that you then take seriously, you know, your own situation, and you think from where you are located, and that informs everything else that you actually end up using as you engage and navigate the world. And I think that is very beautiful and important for reasserting our own agency as Africans. And thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists, for all your presentations and your response to the questions. I actually would like to appreciate our audience for turning up and for participating, and also the participants online. Thank you very much for listening in. I'm not sure whether we have received anything online that needs to be answered. Is there anybody who has sent a question on chat? Okay. So we come to the end of our presentations. This is Team Psychology, team from Educational and Organizational Psychology. And on Friday we are having a